My name is Joe Brown. I'm an attorney at English Lucas Priest and Owsley here in town. Very delighted to be here to have this opportunity. I've been out of law school only just a couple of years, but I miss the academic aspect of the law so much that I thought, well, I can't go back to school, but maybe I can find another way to get academically involved. So I thought I'd try my hand at teaching a class, perhaps. When I first decided I would try to teach a class, I thought, well, I'll do a class on the entire First Amendment. And I began to think about how unfeasible that was to try to put the entire First Amendment into 8 weeks. And I thought, that's not going to do justice to the First Amendment. So I decided to block it off into small sections. And so this class is only going to be about the first 16 words of the First Amendment. And as I said in the email that I sent out to all of you guys last week, there's a whole lot. There are 230 years of court cases interpreting these 16 words that are profoundly interesting. And this class is about religious liberty specifically, and matters of religion. I don't think I have to tell anyone, matters of religion tend to be very controversial, and they have been since the founding of this country and still are today. And so I would love for this class to be one where there's plenty of open discussion and exchange of ideas and different viewpoints, but respecting the fact that we're talking about issues that are profoundly controversial, religion being something that people tend to hold near and dear to their heart, or something to which people take considerable offense. I would ask, and I don't think I have to, I'm very confident that all of us here are very respectful and generous and reasonable in how we'll conduct ourselves. But I'm looking forward to having, somebody, well, that's so-and-so, they're the consistent, they're the flaming liberal, or this person's this staunch conservative. I mean, I would like for that dynamic to kind of show itself in this group. So I'd encourage you all to be open with your views on this thing, on this aspect, your political and religious views. Now, I'm going to stay neutral. I'm just a neutral arbiter here and conduct discussion. But most of what we're going to talk about today isn't going to involve a lot of discussion. We're actually not even going to look at any court cases today. Today is just going to focus on the historical context of the First Amendment religion clause, the ideological background behind the religion clause. Before I go any farther, though, I want to give just a disclaimer. My wife is here, and maybe some of you had a chance to meet her, but I'd like to point out, you might notice that she is in a very blessed condition. She is, as they would say in the old days, she's in the family way. And we are due in May, late May. And so this class is going to go, I think, into the middle of May. And so if the last couple of these classes, if I'm not here, I may be in the hospital helping her give birth to our daughter. So this is our first kid. Okay, any questions before we go any farther? Any remarks? Feel free, guys, to interrupt me.
What law school did you go to?
I went to UK.
You graduated how long ago?
Graduated 2016.
Oh,
Yep.
Right on the shiny new.
Yeah. Still green behind the ear, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
What kind of an attorney are you?
Not a good one.
Do you?
Yes. That's good. I do a variety of things. I'd say about 60% of my practice involves schools. I deal with a lot of school districts, but my practice generally is civil institutional defense. I work for insurance companies who assign our firm with cases with cases involving companies that are they're insured when they get sued or are involved in legal trouble. And so most of what I do is institutional defense. Now, I dabble in all kinds of other things, transactional stuff, but most of what I do is civil litigation on the defense side. Any other questions? All right, let's cut into it. All right. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is the first phrase of the First Amendment. Now, what the heck does it mean? It says Congress shall make no law. Can the president sign an executive order establishing a religion? It doesn't say the president can. It says Congress.
Never thought about that.
But it also doesn't say the states. It doesn't say the city of Bowling Green can't establish a religion. It says Congress. Okay? Shall make no law respecting an establishment religion. Why does it not just say Congress cannot establish a religion? Is it significant that it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment religion? Is that broader than the prohibition against just establishing, or is it narrower? What does this language mean? Okay, this is the most important question we're going to tackle in this class. What's religion? Somebody give me a definition of religion.
An organized system of beliefs.
Organized. So if someone, let's say they don't attend a church, they're not involved in formal ceremonies or anything, but they have convictions about, their worldview has certain convictions about supernatural forces or anything like that, but there's nothing organized to their belief system. Is that going to come under religion?
I think so, not in this way. Because how could you have a law about what someone's beliefs are if there's no organized system and there's no location, there's no leader or definition?
So if the Constitution protects free religion, whatever that person is doing, according to the dictates of their convictions, is not protected. But someone who is in the, see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's a narrow definition.
Doesn't it have to be a group that's big enough to be recognized and establish certain orders and be formalized enough to have somebody say, yes, this is them?
Who is the authority to go and say this is a religion and this is not a religion?
IRS.
The IRS. We are going to get into that later. The IRS, sure. But can there be...
Otherwise, if it wasn't, that basically would be meaningless.
What if I was so... Now, just imagine this is not true. But what if I was so charismatic and so convincing and persuasive that I started a cult right here?
Mm-hmm.
I convinced you that I was God in the flesh or something like that. Let's just say that I was that convincing. And we started a religion right here. I convinced 3 of you to be my followers.
It'd be a cult.
It'd be a cult? Is a cult a religion?
I would say for that purposes, not necessarily.
How do you distinguish between a cult and a religion?
By getting a lot of people together and saying, oh, yeah, this is one, this is one, this is one. No, that's not one.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of people. So you have to, every case...
You could probably vote on it. We'd have an election on it.
So the majority would...
Especially when our religions basically have come down to us from before. And so we have an idea of what they are, but now the ones that are starting up, as you suggest, we could say, wow, are you sure? And in fact, haven't the Catholics had to contend with that for a long time? And they said, oh, this is not religion, this is not a religion, this is not a religion, this is not a religion, this is heresy.
Sure, but with respect to the government, who in the government's going to say, you guys here, what you're doing is religion. What you're doing over here is not religion. For instance, this was framed in 1789, Mormonism. There's how many tens of millions of Mormons in this country was non-existent as a movement, as a religious movement until later 1850s. I'm sorry?
The Catholics think they're a cult and not a religion. And
Yeah.
and also, what did someone tell me? Oh, the whole Catholic Church in the United States is still in missionary status. So,
The missionaries, I mean, they're the largest religious group in the country.
well, that's yeah, but they're still new. They haven't matured enough to be.
Is it something to do with the financial side of things?
I'm asking you guys.
I mean, the definition of a religion, that it's not for profit, for instance, that if you start your own religion, it's not because you just want to.
What if my religious beliefs are I have to collect money? I mean, who here goes to church and you do have to pass the plate, don't you? Yes.
I wondered if we could back up just a step or two.
Go ahead.
The first 10 amendments were all passed at the same time, correct?
Yeah. Now we're going to get more specifically into that, maybe the end of this class, but definitely by
Well,
next class.
Okay.
The specific framing. But go ahead.
I was just saying, or thinking, okay, we're digging into this right away, but let's get a little background on it. Where did this come from? Why weren't all 10 included in the original Constitution? Why were they amendments?
And
Which states, so to speak, are behind maybe individual amendments that may make a difference?
that is the question that we will tackle maybe by the end of this class, but definitely by the beginning of next class. We're going to talk specifically, even the debates on the floor of the House of Representatives when this was being framed in 1789. But, go ahead.
What about free exercise? That is, to me, the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Because, you're saying if you could believe anything and say it's a religion, you can say the free exercise is not prohibited. Well, you know what? I believe in,
Snakes aren't.
well, also, illegal sexual activity, the use of children.
Sure.
That's what a lot of cults do.
Yeah.
Or some,
Sure.
anyway, I've heard people say, well, this guy's a cult, it's a religion.
Can they, under the auspices of religion, can that be exempt from government regulation? So that's one of the things we're going to get into in this class. There are certain
multiple wives. Some people
Sure.
multiple wives.
that's going to be one of the first cases we read. It's United States versus Reynolds involving that exact question.
And
No, I think
So you pointed out. Go ahead. Yeah.
today, I think perhaps we look at words far more broadly than at the time that this amendment was written. I don't know that the founding fathers, for example, could even imagine the variety of religious experiences in the modern world. I think their basic concern was the Puritans had this area and they wouldn't let anybody into Massachusetts who wasn't a Puritan, and the people down here were Church of England, and so
See.
that was an early issue, but to them it was limited to maybe Protestant and Catholic and known established religions. But
Okay.
today that word, as you were pointing out, is loaded.
A few questions then. So if we need to construe this language, if a court has to look at this and say, what did the framers, what did the people who framed this, what did it mean to them? Do that consistently with the rest of the Constitution. Take that, for instance, to the Eighth Amendment with the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments. How would the Founding Fathers, as we call them, how would they have thought about cruel and unusual punishments? They were prepared to use the death penalty for a lot more things than we were. Also, who are the framers? Who are you talking about?
Elected representatives, supposedly elected.
yeah, but they were
Yeah.
a constitutional convention. People came and
Yeah.
debated, and some people wrote good articles, but I never read them.
So the people at the Philadelphia Convention who drafted the Constitution.
Yeah.
But who ratified the Constitution?
All the states.
The states.
Rhode Island.
The states, but what are the first three words of the Constitution, literally? We the people. Does it say we the people in 1789? says we the people. Does that mean us today?
It was just landowners then, wasn't it? Male landowners.
Yeah.
Sure, but I mean, but you can't look at the Constitution and say, well, this only since we the people only meant white male landowners then, and it can only apply to white male landowners now.
A lot of people think that way.
You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So I mean, one other thought, and then we'll go on. If we are looking to what did the framers intend, what does that mean about our regard for the rule of law? If we are a people that's governed by laws, but yet we're going to have to keep on looking back 250 years to say, what was in James Madison's mind? What was in Thomas Jefferson's mind? What was in George Washington's mind? Are we not under a democracy of the dead? Are we not? I mean, what happened to rule of law there? If this is our law, if that's governing us, go ahead.
It could be a balancing act.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I will credit the founders for being far better read than I will ever be. I mean, they read the
Me too, yeah.
They read
Mm-hmm.
philosophy that got up at 4 in the morning by candlelight to do it,
Mm-hmm.
and I read jump stuff, you know, fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But therefore, I will credit them with having given great and deep thought and bringing forward traditions that went all the way back to Greece and Rome and way back.
You guys are teaching my class for me.
And,
love it.
and I bring today, okay?
Mhm.
But today needs to also honor the thought that went into writing that.
Yeah.
So
Some
it's a constant tension.
There certainly is. Some people will say, look, when a court, because courts are the ones who, under our system of government, a court is the one who is going to interpret this language in a certain case. Let's say when a court is deciding a contract case, let's say that me and one of you in here are in a contract, and we have a contract, and it says, you're going to provide me with 150 widgets packaged in the normal commercial standard packaging for $1,000. And then the court, we have a disagreement, we take it to court for a breach of contract, and the court says, okay, I'm looking at this contract to see who's winning. What does this language of this contract mean? The court is going to look at what was our original intent, the parties, the contracting parties. So if a court reads a contract like that, if that's how a court deals with documents, isn't it just consistent for when the court looks at the Constitution? What was the original intent? What was the intent of the people when they drafted this? But then we run into the same issues that I just spoke of before. So this is what we're going to get into in this class. What does this mean? How do we even start arriving at what this means? It's a very profound question. It's why it's so controversial. You see? For instance, like pretty much everybody agrees, or it's just common knowledge for constitutional scholars that there are two clauses here. What's the first clause? Establishment. So where would the end be? Where would the line be between the two clauses?
Of religion,
Here?
yeah, and then
Okay.
or prohibiting.
So that's one clause, this is the other. Okay, so do you think a prohibition against an establishment is distinct from prohibiting the free exercise?
Mhm.
Or are they the same thing?
There's a connection.
Yeah, the or.
Thereof.
What about though the establishment? I mean, wasn't this developed beginning because in England you had to belong to this Church of England?
We're going to get into that.
And now they're saying, no, you don't have to be
Mm-hmm.
this church or any church.
Yeah.
And some of the guys thought that was fine. They thought you didn't need a church.
And since that was one of the reasons that some people left the old country.
Absolutely. You guys are teaching my class for me. I'm so glad that you guys are.
Because of state-sponsored religion, they wanted to ensure that wouldn't be repeated here.
Absolutely.
So that's clearly authorial intent in the founders who were aware of that past, and that alternative in Europe, and didn't want to replicate here.
But the question I want us to have on our minds is, does the authorial intent matter? That's something to think about. That's something to think about throughout this entire course. And if it does, what's the authorial intent? How do we find the authorial intent? How do we go back to 1789 and say, hey, framers, whoever you are, whether you're this select group of white,
Did they
wealthy.
not write a little bit about that?
I'm sorry?
Didn't they write a little bit about that?
They did write a little bit about that, but some of them, including Madison and Jefferson, wanted their papers burned so that people would not do that very thing. So what do you think about that? If you have people who were influential in the framing of the Constitution who wanted their papers to be destroyed so that people wouldn't do what we're trying to do right now, what do you make of that?
They wanted more civil wars.
Maybe Thomas Jefferson did.
Well, they wanted,
There would have been debates in Congress before these amendments are
I've actually,
finalized.
you're anticipating one thing we're going to look at. We're going to actually look at the debate on the House floor when this is being framed. And I'll be honest with you, you'll see for yourself when we get there, you can't make head nor tail of it, what they mean. There are people who say it means this, people who says it means this. So this is what courts have to grapple with. They have to grapple with, what in the heck does this mean? How do we find out what it means? Does it mean when the Constitution says we the people, does this mean what we the people understand it to mean now, or do we have to go back to 1789 and try to get into the mind of the framers, whoever the framers are, and say, what is it? What did you intend here? What did this mean then? So I'll cut this great discussion. Thank you, guys.
isn't that partly a feature of language, the way we use language, that it requires interpretation?
Sure.
You see that when you talk about literature, you can't
Absolutely.
state conclusively what Shakespeare means. I mean, it's open to interpretation because it's words.
But, I mean, if you and I disagree on what Act 3, Scene 5 of Hamlet means, we're not talking about civil liberties at stake, are we?
No, but it's a process.
Maybe, but.
We're talking about the same process of
Well,
interpretation.
Sure, it's
You know what? If what you're going on, it says someone that bases their arguments on the Constitution is just blowing smoke.
who's blowing smoke?
People that would argue, say this is what's in the Constitution.
That what's in the Constitution?
Yeah, that this is in the my
Whatever their
view is in
opinion
the Constitution,
I see.
and you're saying
Okay.
no, they're not.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, this is great discussion. Wonderful. I love it. You guys, this is going to be so fun. I'm so excited that I did this. But I want to get into actually, I'm going to lecture for a little bit. You guys have to listen to me for a little bit. But please feel at liberty to interrupt and ask, if you interject, anything like that. So what we want to do is let's pretend for a minute that we really do care, as I think some of us do. And I haven't made my mind up. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Do we care what this meant? When they framed this, what did they intend? So to do that, we need to step back and go pretty far back in time to look at the historical context and the ideological backgrounds upon which the First Amendment is grounded. So let's go back. I think that there are three worldviews, three schools of thought, three sets of ideas that were tremendously influential to the revolutionary generation, to that generation of people who founded our country. The colonial America, the idea, their worldview, how they saw the world was shaped by three very powerful and influential ideas. And I've given you a chart here, and those three are Calvinism, liberalism, and republicanism. So I'd like to go through each of those. Calvinism. Now, with respect to each of these three are ideas that stemmed out of a European movement. But I would suggest to you that these three European movements, even though they are distinctly European, they had tremendous effects in the colonies. And I would even say that there are a lot of people who think that the ultimate fruition of these movements, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Renaissance, the ultimate fruition of those movements came true in the founding of the American Republic. So let's look at each of these three ideas, starting with Calvinism. Calvinism is a theological set of ideas. It's a religious ideology that came out of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. So throughout the Middle Ages, for the few centuries leading up to the 16th century, the 1500s, European civilization was marked by an unquestioned subjection to authority. In the universities in Europe, if you were a student in the university, your learning experience was marked by an unquestioned subjection to authority. That authority was, after we've looked at what the Bible says and what the church says, what did Aristotle say? That was called scholasticism. We're going to start at, Aristotle had the last word on everything. And so if there's something we haven't thought about yet, we'll look at what the Bible says and what Aristotle said, and we'll use the principles of logic to get to where we want to get to off of what either the Bible or Aristotle said. So we see this obedience to authority. So that's academically. What about politically? Well, you had monarchs who were the absolute authority. They were unquestioned. It was believed that they were appointed by God, and since they were appointed by God, what they said was divine. What I mean by that is to obey the king or to obey the monarch was to obey God, one and the same. That's what this time period in European civilization was marked by. This is also true in church matters. By the turn of the 16th century, there had been a long period of turmoil in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Western Church, the church of Western Europe. There had been a succession of popes. There was a period of time where there was 3 popes at one time, but by the turn of the 16th century, the Pope and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope had established a supremacy. And so we see this notion of authority. The Pope was the authority, and then after him, the church councils. So you see the subjection to authority. Now, after a few centuries of this, some people began to see that this pattern of subjection of authority had left European civilization in a state of pretty terrible moral and cultural and ecclesiastical decay. They looked around and they said, we have been kind of asleep and blindly obedient to authority for so long that we have allowed our civilization to become stagnant and corrupt. And so you have some reform movements. And so in 1517, a German monk, anyone want to guess his name? Martin Luther. A German monk named Martin Luther, he is absolutely convinced of the corruptions in the church, the theological corruptions, the moral corruptions of the priesthood, theological error being taught and propagated in the church. And he became convinced that what the state of the church was in at that time was corrupt and it needed to be drastically reformed. So in 1517, he started a firestorm by going to the Castle Church in Wittenberg and nailed his 95 Theses on the door, and he erupted the Protestant Reformation. It was a big deal, and it was such a big deal that he ultimately went on trial for heresy. He was indicted for heresy, and while he was on trial, his trial was at a conference called the Diet of Worms, and the prosecutor's name was Johann Eck. And Johann Eck, the prosecutor, he laid out all of Luther's books and writings, and he asked 2 questions to the defendant, to Luther. 1, are these your works? Did you write these? Everything they deem to be heretical. 2, will you recant? Now, Luther's response, his very defiant response, echoes through the ages to us. If any of you are Lutheran, there are a lot of Lutherans who have memorized this. Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Holy Scriptures or by evident reason, for I can believe neither Pope nor councils alone, as it is clear that they have erred repeatedly and contradicted themselves, I consider myself convicted by the testimony of Holy Scripture, which is my basis. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. Thus I cannot and will not recant, because acting against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me. Acting against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. That's a very interesting idea in 1521, when all of European civilization for the past 200 or 300 years had been marked by an unquestioned subjection to authority in all matters. So Luther is saying there's a part of me, you government/church authority, there's a part of me that's not subject to you. My conscience, my beliefs are not subject to your power. My conscience has allegiance elsewhere. That's a revolutionary idea. We take that for granted. So we have the Protestant Reformation. So you had, from 1521 to 1555, you had Europe in an absolute state of turmoil, of religious wars and political turmoil until the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where it was basically a draw, and the Catholics and Protestants met, and they go, look, we'll tolerate you, you tolerate us, we'll call it a draw. You guys who are Lutheran, you guys can be Lutheran, we'll be Catholic, and we'll all just chill out, okay? But there's one thing that they wouldn't tolerate in either of the kingdoms, whether Lutheran or Catholic, and that was a very radical branch of the Reformation known as Calvinism. So the Lutheran churches had enacted pretty significant reforms, but in Geneva, there were a group of people who did not think that Luther had gone quite far enough in reforming the church. And so we had this ideology, this more radical branch of the Reformation known as Calvinism. Now, what do you guys know? Define Calvinism. What you know about
predestination.
Predestination.
Election.
Election.
Pretty much the same.
Anyone know the 5 points of Calvinism? This was total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. Those are the canons of Dort. That's from the Council of Dort, by the way. But I would suggest to you there are only 2 points of Calvinism. As it pertains to how we're understanding now, there are 2 points to Calvinism. One, God is absolutely sovereign over all human affairs. Absolutely sovereign. That's what Calvinists believe. 2, man is entirely and totally depraved, completely and radically corrupted by sin. So we have these 2 absolute truths. God is absolutely sovereign over all human affairs. 2, man is absolutely wicked. Okay, that was what the Calvinists, the more radical branch of the Reformation, taught. Now, this was not an ideology. While the crowned heads of Europe were willing to tolerate Lutheranism, they were not willing to tolerate Calvinism. Why do you think? What are the political implications of such a theology? If you think that God and God alone is absolutely sovereign over human affairs, what does that mean about the king?
He's human.
He's not.
Rules the divine right of kings, I guess.
Well, not necessarily, but it means that the king was placed there. I mean, think of how Calvinists would look at something like Pharaoh in the Old Testament. He was used, but he was wicked. And so, but Calvinists would look at a monarch and say, God is absolutely sovereign, you're not. And so insofar as what you command violates what we think God commands, we will be civilly disobedient. See, the medieval belief was, as you said, the divine right of kings. God has placed the monarch here. To obey God is to obey the monarch.
So that's the beginning of law is God rather than God is law. Or wait, the other way around.
Oh, we're waxing a little more philosophical than I'd like to get. That's going to get pretty profound. I guess what I'm getting at is that the reason that Calvinism, while the kingdoms in Europe and all the principalities throughout Europe were willing to tolerate, they finally, after coming to a draw, they were willing to tolerate Lutheranism. They were not willing to tolerate, at least not easily, not willing to tolerate Calvinism because of the political implications. If you think that God, if these people were convinced that God is absolutely sovereign over human affairs, that means the king wasn't. That means that they're obeying God rather than the king. And they also believe if all men are wicked, that means the king is wicked. That means the bishops are wicked. That means the nobility, they're wicked. That means they can err. They can go wrong. That's their nature. So you can start to see the political implications of this theology, can't you? So the Church of England, now I don't know if many of you are familiar with how the Church of England came about, but it wasn't a righteous endeavor, so to speak. Henry VIII, long story short, had 6 wives, the second of which is the reason why, primarily, why England became a Protestant country. Now, there were plenty of Protestant sentiments in England, but it came about through a very peculiar means. But the Reformation in England was I would say, a conservative Reformation. They adopted, the Church of England adopted a statement of faith called the 39 Articles, which was it was a decidedly Protestant theology, but they maintained the same Catholic order of priesthood, of the bishops. They maintained the vestments, the religious garb that the priests wore with the hats and everything. They maintained the high liturgical, ceremonial systems and everything like that. So the theology changed, and there was a break with the papacy, but the church pretty much looked the same. It was a conservative Reformation in England. But there were Protestants, there were bishops, and there were clergy within the Church of England who were of the Calvinist persuasion. They had been in Geneva with the reformers there in Geneva. They were influenced by people like Calvin and John Knox and Theodore Beza. And they looked at the Church of England and they said, this is not Protestant enough. They wanted to purify the church. All of these, what they saw as the remnants and vestiges of Catholicism, the vestments, the prayer books, the priesthood, the liturgies. They saw these things and they wanted to purify the church. They wanted a purely Protestant church. What do we call these people? The Puritans. Okay? The Puritans, they got that name because they wanted to purify the Church of England. They wanted to stay in the Church of England. They didn't want to leave the Church of England, but they wanted the Church of England. It wasn't quite Protestant enough for them. They wanted the church to be more Protestant. Okay, so they were the Calvinists in the Church of England, but there was a party even more radical than the Puritans, a more radically Calvinist group. They wanted to follow the example of the Church of Scotland. They wanted to not only do away with all those the vestments and the prayer books and everything. They wanted to abolish the episcopacy, the bishop order altogether, and replace the church order with assemblies of local church elders called presbyteries. What do we call these people? Presbyterians. There was an even more radical group of Calvinists in the Church of England, or in England, who said, you know what, the Church of England, she's not even worth saving. She's not even worth trying to redeem. She's too much. The church is so caught up in popery, as they would have called it, that we want to separate from the church altogether. What do you think we call this? Separatists. And these separatists, they went even farther than the Presbyterians went. They thought, we're going to separate from the church. We're separatists, and we want to organize our churches around each congregation. Each congregation of believers should have its own autonomous authority. They wanted to each congregation to be some congregationalists. So we can see, just in this breakdown, we have these progressively more radically Calvinist groups in England that have they have issues with the way the Church of England is. So you have the Puritans who are wanting to stay in the church but want to purify the church, the Presbyterians who want to go farther, then you get into the separatists. So you get more radically Calvinist groups. The most radical group, more radical than the Puritans, more radical than the Presbyterians, more radical than even the separatist Congregationalists. Not only do they want to separate and have congregational authority, they wanted church membership only restricted to those who made a profession of faith and only baptize people who were able to make a profession of faith. Who were these people? Baptists. The most radically Calvinist sect in England. Okay? Now, as you can imagine, they met, and some of you discussed earlier, these groups, these radically Calvinistic sects in England met with a lot of persecution. And it coincided with the time that there were these new colonies in North America. And so they saw an escape. They thought, we are here living in Babylon, and we want to be freed. We want to go to the New World and escape this persecution. So in 1620, a group of very radical separatists, very radical Calvinists, boarded a ship in Plymouth Harbor. Anybody know the name of the ship? The Mayflower, in 1620, and they sailed to America. And on the way there, they entered into a covenant on the ship, covenanting with one another to begin establishing a new Christian colony. They said, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic. They didn't land in Northern Virginia. Anybody know where they landed? Ultimately Massachusetts, and they named the place Plymouth after where they came from. So we begin to see these radical Calvinist group hightailing it out of England come to the New World. And then, just 8 years later, you have an even bigger group coming, a group of about 1,000 people. So these Calvinists, the Puritans, this big group of Puritans, they ended up, it was really interesting how they do it. They really kind of deceived the king, and they talked the king into saying, like, hey, we have this, we're all these businessmen, and we have this idea, we want to go start a colony and see how profitable it is. We're not trying to establish any kind of religious civilization. We just want to try to make some money. Oh, and yeah, we're also all radically Calvinist Puritans, but we're just in this for money. Just trust us, right? This is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Massachusetts Bay Company. And so in 1628, a fleet of 30 ships full of 1,000 people, they were all supposed to be employees of the Massachusetts Bay Company, but they were all Puritan families, load up in these ships and take off to Massachusetts Bay. And on the way there, their governor, by the name of John Winthrop, preached a sermon to them. In this sermon, if you can remember how many presidents have quoted this sermon, I'll read it to you and see if you've heard it before. We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. When he shall make us a praise and glory, that all men shall say of succeeding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. People, I think it's Ronald Reagan to Obama, have quoted that sermon. I don't know how many other presidents have. The city upon a hill. What did they have in mind when they were saying, look, we're headed to America, we're going to be a city on the hill? You'll always hear people say, and this is true, the Puritans came to America in search of religious liberty. What did the Puritans mean by religious liberty, though?
They were in control, not somebody else.
Yeah, okay. My wife got me this book for my birthday. And this will show what a nerd I am. This is a book. You can barely read it because it's in archaic colonial script. But it's a book of all the laws in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. And in a set of laws, now listen to what this is called, a set of laws known as the Body of Liberties of the Massachusetts colony. The Body of Liberties. Okay. Here's the first one. Civil authority hath power and liberty to see the peace, ordinances, and rules of Christ observed in every church according to his word. They're saying the government has the liberty to make sure that the churches are administering the word of God. Now, don't you think that's a little bit differently than how we think of religious liberty? Okay, here's the next one. Listen, this document is called the Body of Liberties. If any man, after legal conviction, shall worship any other god but the Lord, he shall be put to death. This is called the Body of Liberties. If any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. If any person blaspheme the name of God, the Father, Son, or Holy Ghost, with direct, express, presumptuous, or high-handed blasphemy, or shall curse God in the like manner, he shall be put to death. This is the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Does this sound like liberties? It doesn't sound like liberties to me. But listen to this next one. All the people of God within this jurisdiction who are not in a church way and be orthodox in judgment and not scandalous in life shall have full liberty to gather themselves into a church estate, provided they do it in a Christian way with due observation of the rules of Christ revealed in his word. So they're saying bodies of believers have a liberty to join together and go to church. So you can start to see, let me read the last one. Every church hath full liberty to exercise all of the ordinances of God according to the rules of Scripture. So you can you start to see what they mean specifically by religious liberty? It's kind of different than what we think of. It's not individual liberty. It's institutional and corporate liberty. They saw themselves as Israel leaving Egypt. And they're not coming so that everybody can do their own thing. They're coming, look, we are knit together as one body, as John Winthrop said, and we are going to found a Calvinist civilization predicated upon God's word as we understand it. But they saw this as religious liberty. But as you saw, they are not tolerating religious liberty for anybody else, as you mentioned. But this was what religious liberty meant to them. When it says the people who are not in a church way have the liberty to get into a church estate. Maybe 40 or 50 years ago, this was more common, but out in the country, has anyone ever heard of a brush harbor meeting? You have? What's a brush harbor meeting?
I think it's, they used to have a meeting, a tent meeting like across the road where I used to live.
A tent meeting? Who?
Field,
Who's this?
these were
But I mean, what kind of group is it?
they're Baptist,
A church, right?
yeah.
Okay, so a brush harbor meeting, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, where my grandfather growing up, he would go to them, is where people out in the country would just go out into the woods and clear a place out, and they would have a church service, a revival right there in the middle of the wilderness. This comes from a long history from England and Scotland of these radical Calvinist group, because it was outlawed for them to meet together in a meeting house or in a town. If they had done this out in the open, they'd have been strung up by their toes or something. So they had to, at night, gather together, go out and clear a place in the wilderness and have their services, have their meeting there. And so people, even up till about 40 or 50 years ago in rural Kentucky, did that as a tradition. So that's what this is aiming at. That's the kind of, they're reacting to that persecution they had. Go ahead.
These were a group called Regular Baptist.
Yeah, the regular Baptist.
Yeah.
Yeah, the real old, they call them the hard shells. Yeah, but look at the Puritans, their idea of religious liberty is not, we're going to come here so everybody can do their own thing. No, how they viewed religious liberty is, religious liberty means we have the liberty to come here and set up a Calvinist civilization. We have the liberty to come up here and to come over here and set up and establish the true religion. That's the way they saw religious liberty. I want to share with you this. In 1647, how are we on time? Does anybody need a bathroom break, water break, anything?
6:26.
Okay. If anybody can feel, am I going? There should be like a break here, shouldn't there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You guys can go ahead and take 5 minutes or so and get water or anything like that. I don't want to go on too long.
Teresa, can you make it back? It's good to get up and stretch.
Oh, definitely.
You're up there. Where's the?
government didn't actually fire him. He wasn't engaging in political activity. So does he have, does the First Amendment just say government can't do the wrong thing, even if it's the proper motives, even when it's not doing something wrong? Or does it say you have private right, even if you're really not engaging in activity, to be free from the bad motives? I found that case really absolutely. Oh, Alex Jones. Yeah.
Anything else, you'll fight. It's gonna have to be.
There's a quote that answers half the questions. You know this?
Let's see.
I'm sure you do. How's this person? Freedom stated.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into some Jefferson quotes. That are going to be pretty
The
intriguing.
sunbeam. Gorgeous writing.
Oh.
That's cool. So he was giving them out.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I'm not sure where I got that.
he didn't want to give them up.
That's it.
Went to the class before this. Was living in here. States.
Right.
Not a good idea. Too long. Oh. I wasn't quite sure if it was an exercise class or it was a mind.
No, it's being wonderful. We can keep absorbing until I'm just recognizing.
I want to read you a statute from the Massachusetts General Court passed in 1647. It being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, as in former times by keeping them in an unknown tongue, so in these latter times by persuading from the use of tongues, that at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded and corrupted with love and false glosses of seeming deceivers, and to the end that learning may not be buried in the grave of our forefathers in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting our endeavors, it is therefore ordered that every township in this jurisdiction, after the Lord hath increased them to 50 households, shall forthwith appoint one within their town to teach all such children as shall resort to him to read and write, whose wages shall be paid either by the parents or masters of such children, by the inhabitants in general, or by way of supply, as the major part of those that order the prudentials of the town shall appoint. This is the first compulsory education law in America. Why was it passed?
Read the Bible.
To read the Bible. This is in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, to this day, has always had the highest performing public education system in the country. And it was started in 1647. The reason was we don't want people to be biblically ignorant. We do not want things to be in the state that they were before the Reformation. So we've looked at how the Puritans view religious liberty. But there were some people in Massachusetts Bay Colony that weren't really so gung-ho about the Puritans' idea of establishing Calvinism by law. There in 1644, there was or earlier than that, actually started preaching, was in the 1630s. There was a radical minister by the name of Roger Williams, and he preached a very radical different form of religious liberty. Let me just read you this quote from him. All civil states, with their officers of justice and their respective constitutions and administrations, are essentially civil, and therefore not judges, governors, or defenders of the spiritual or Christian state and worship. It is the will and command of God that since the coming of his Son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciences and worship be granted to all men in all nations and countries. And they are only to be fought against with that sword which is only in soul matters able to conquer, to wit, the sword of the Spirit, the word of God. God requireth not any uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state, which enforced uniformity sooner or later as the greatest occasion of civil war, ravishing consciousness, persecution of Christ Jesus and his servants, and the hypocrisy and destructions of millions. An enforced uniformity of religion throughout a nation or civil state confounds the civil and religious and denies the principles of Christianity. There ought be a hedge wall between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. Listen to that last quote. A wall between the church. Okay, this is coming from Roger Williams. So he's saying there should not be any establishment of religion whatsoever, even for Calvinism. He's speaking as a radical Calvinist, as a Baptist. He is speaking and saying there should not be an establishment of religion. Why? Because it's contrary, it's antithetical to the very idea of Christianity. It violates the freedom of conscience, and it causes hypocrisy. What do you think they did to this guy? They didn't kill him.
No,
Send him to Rhode Island.
They banished him. If I can find it, there's actually the Massachusetts General Court order with the statute they wrote to banish him. They sent him to Narragansett Bay, and he bought some land from the Indians there. He called it Providence Plantations because the providence of God had delivered him. And it eventually became Rhode Island Colony. And this was the first colony established that was centered around freedom of conscience, freedom of worship. He allowed the Indians that lived in that colony to worship however they wanted to. The laws were not like the Puritans in Massachusetts, where if you're not worshiping the right God, you're going to get killed.
What year?
That was in 1647. I'm sorry, 1636 was when he would have started Providence Plantation. So you have, as exemplified by Roger Williams, you have a different strand of Calvinist thought with respect to religious liberty. You have the Puritan strand. To them, religious liberty means liberty to be free from the monarchy and the heretical powers of Europe to establish Calvinist orthodoxy. That's their version. But then you have a different strand of Calvinist thought, a different strand that the Massachusetts General Court called new and dangerous ideas. And this new strand opposed any establishment of religion at all. They believe, since they started with that supposition of Calvinism, that man's heart is so depraved that no amount of government coercion is going to truly result in conversion. Government power is not going to save his soul. Therefore, it's just going to cause hypocrisy. Do you see that? Do you see from that perspective, from that worldview, how that makes sense to them? To quote an emphatically Calvinist document from 1646, the Westminster Confession of Faith, God alone is Lord of the conscience and has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men. which are in anything contrary to his word or beside it, in matters of faith or worship. So that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commands out of conscience is to betray true liberty of conscience, and the requiring of an implicit faith and an absolute and blind obedience is to destroy liberty of conscience and reason also. So you had the Baptists, this most radical Calvinist sect, who are saying, no, we do not support any establishment of religion at all. We believe that people should have authentic and absolute freedom of conscience. This is what Martin Luther was getting at. You see that idea coming back? That there's a part of human activity that the government should not have a right to regulate at all. So we see those two distinct strands. You see the establishmentarian strand of Calvinism, and you see the anti-establishmentarian strand of Calvinism. Now, after the English Civil War in 1649, you did have in England, you had about a 20-year period of Calvinist rule called the Commonwealth, or the Protectorate, under Oliver Cromwell. But then in 1660, there was the restoration of the monarchy. And when the monarchy was restored, there was very heavy persecution of not just the radical Calvinists, the Presbyterians, the Separatists, the Congregationalist Baptists, but even the Puritans then began to come under a lot of persecution from the other mainstream branches of the Anglican Church. And so then you start seeing a more mass exodus of Calvinists and Puritans from England into the colonies. By the time of the Revolution, now hear me out, this is not to deny even then that there was a tremendous amount of religious diversity, and it's certainly, this has no implications on the broad array of religious diversity here and now in this country. But it's pretty undeniable to say that by the time of the Revolution, by about 1774, the overwhelming majority of the people who lived in the 13 colonies were evangelical Protestants who were, to one extent or another, were very influenced by Calvinism. And to show you how much, when the Revolution broke out, let me back up. So what were some of the things that caused the Revolution? People always say the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, things like that. One of the things that didn't even happen, it was just proposed, that made people in the colonies so angry at Parliament, is it was even just proposed, the proposal of a bishop being appointed over the colonies caused so much uproar that Parliament backed off of it in the late 1760s. They were like, no, if we do that, we're certainly going to have a war on our hands. People in the colonies are not going to tolerate that, not going to tolerate an Anglican bishop in the colonies. When the Revolutionary War broke out, King George III, he didn't call it, when he talked about it, he didn't call it, well, the American Revolution. What do you think he called it? The Presbyterian Rebellion. King George and even most of the British generals, when they referred to the war, they called it the Presbyterian Rebellion. That's how much they associated this rebellion against the crown's authority with Calvinism. So we see that's the first school of thought or ideology which really had a profound influence on the colonial or revolutionary generation, their mindset. So second, we'll probably get through this or touch on it, and then we're out of here. The second one is liberalism, kind of an ideological counterweight to Calvinism. Now, I want to make a disclaimer here. When I say liberalism, I am not talking about liberalism in the sense that we mean it in contemporary American political parlance. I'm not talking about progressivism. Now, there are some things in common, but I'm not talking about liberalism and how we mean it today, like when so-and-so identifies today as a political liberal. That's not what we're talking about. Liberalism in the classical sense. If you were to go in European political parlance, the word liberal still carries the connotation that we're going to talk about today. But in America, when people say liberal, they tend to mean progressive. I want us to not be anachronistic here. So, along with the Reformation, out of which Calvinism came, another movement in Europe that had profound effects and arguably came to its full fruition in the American Republic, in the Revolutionary War, was liberalism. So the liberalism was something that came out of the Enlightenment. So just this, about the same time as the later ages of the Reformation's going on, you have the Enlightenment. So what was the Enlightenment? So we talked earlier about during the Middle Ages, you had this blind obedience, this unquestioned subjection to authority, right? In the universities, in politics, in religion, subjection to authority. Well, people in the universities studying philosophy began to reject the academic authority, because academic authority was, okay, Aristotle was the last word. He is the final word on all philosophical matters. So therefore, whatever Aristotle said, we're taking that as gospel truth, and whatever he didn't say, we're going to look at what Aristotle did and apply logic to arrive at what we should know about X. People began to question this, and one man, René Descartes, thought, well, what if we did away with all of that authority? What if we just said, well, we don't know anything? What if we said we can't trust that authority? So what René Descartes did, he did a thought experiment and said, what if I doubt everything? How do I know anything? So the Enlightenment involved a epistemological revolution. Epistemology meaning the philosophy of knowledge, how we know things. So René Descartes, how do we know something? So René Descartes was saying, well, I'm not going to trust what the scholastics say. I'm not going to trust Aristotle and the church. Well, how can I figure out the way I know something? I'll just doubt everything. Now, how do I know something at all? Well, I'm doubting, therefore I know that I exist. So I can start there. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So this was revolutionary. This was this beginning of this rejection of the scholastic authority and starting with truth that comes from in my own mind. Rather than we know things based upon what we can build upon authority, it's rejecting that and saying we can know things based on our own thought. So you had Descartes, and then you had, along with him, you had thinkers like Francis Bacon and John Locke and David Hume. They believed in empiricism, that man can know things by his senses, by the five senses. We can ascertain things empirically. What we see, what we do. We don't need the authority of the church and the Bible and Aristotle to tell us anything, because we can ascertain things through our own experience. And then you had philosophers like Thomas Reid and Francis Hutcheson in Scotland, who said, no, you don't need to process everything through an experience. All people have this innate common sense, this common sense about whereby we know things. We don't have to trust the authority. We don't have to rely on the authority. We have a common sense whereby we can ascertain things, truths that are self-evident. So this is this philosophical revolution called the Enlightenment. Now, meanwhile, at the same time, you have scientists during this Enlightenment period. You have a scientific revolution. You have people like Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo, Johann Kepler, Isaac Newton. They're looking at the world anew. And whereas during the Middle Ages, when everything came from authority, Aristotle and the church said all of the universe revolves around the world, revolves around the earth. Well, they looked at the world with new inventions like the telescope and microscope, and they saw something different. So they began to challenge the authority of the Bible and of the church and of Aristotle. And they looked at the world and they saw that the world, nature, was not governed directly by God's providence, but by natural laws. So like when Newton, when you have that famous story about the apple falling on his head, and it somehow leads him to come up with gravity. So you have this notion of the world of nature being governed by natural forces, natural laws. And then you have people who are familiar with this new science, and they say, well, okay, nature is governed by natural forces, natural laws. Is it also true that human affairs, economics, politics, morality, are those also governed by natural laws? So the Scottish economist Adam Smith, his theory of capitalism, predicated on the belief that the markets are controlled by an invisible hand of supply and demand, and they're natural forces that govern these things. So these liberal philosophers, this is what this philosophy became to be called liberalism. They theorized that morality and politics were governed by natural law the same way that natural processes were, like gravity and the tides coming in and out, because they imagined man in a state of nature. Whereas Calvinism taught that man by nature was totally corrupt and wicked, the liberals saw man in a state of nature as completely free and as rational. And whereas in the Middle Ages, the idea of government was that the state was ordained by God to restrain wickedness and conform everyone to obeying his will, liberals had a revolutionary revision of the notion of the government. They believed that since man's natural state was abject freedom, that the state was the product of free individuals entering into a social contract. What do I mean by that? So liberals believe that everybody by nature is free. So imagine that let's say we're on a cruise ship taking this class, and we crash on a desert island. We're in a state of nature. Let's say we're every man for himself. I'm going to go about and I'm going to dig my own food, look for my own bananas and pineapples and things, and you're going to do the same. I have, in that state of nature, a liberty to do whatever I want. But if we all have those liberties, your liberty is going to start getting into mine, because if I have pineapples and you want pineapples, what's stopping you from taking them from me? So, despite the fact we all have liberty, we have this common interest where, hey, I may want to forfeit some of my liberty and get into this mutual contract with these other people to form a society so that I may protect my property. Do you see? This is a fundamental revision of what the purpose and the function of government. In the Middle Ages, the purpose of government was to make everybody obedient to God's will. To liberals, the function of the government was to protect liberty. The liberals believed that men had voluntarily entered into forming these societies by a social contract. Does that make sense? So the purpose of the government was not to restrain, but to enforce contracts. Think of it this way. Think about society in the Middle Ages. Every aspect of your life, if you lived during the Middle Ages, even not just the Middle Ages, but even so far as even in the 1800s, every aspect of your life was governed by status. Who your parents were, where you were born, what your social status was, governed by status. Due to the influence of liberalism, all of our relations now, all of our life is determined by contract. Think about it. How human life in Western civilization is transformed just by that very idea. So liberals believed in the social contract. And if you start thinking about it, if the government is a result of a social contract, if people entered together to form it in order to protect their property and their liberty, then when the government stops protecting their liberty, they have the prerogative to enter into another contract, to redo it, to reform the contract. Just the same way as if me and Miss Davies, if I contracted with her to mow my yard, but I didn't like the way she was mowing, I would contract with someone else. If you understand government as a contract, doesn't that make sense? So you can start to see the liberal philosopher who was most profoundly influential to the American founders was John Locke. Let me read you a quote from John Locke's second treatise on civil government. The end of the law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. The great and chief end, therefore, of men uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Now, let me read you a document. Now, if we have a pretty good grasp on what liberalism is now, this rejection of authority and this reformulation of human nature and this reformulation of the purpose of government. Let me read you a document and see if you can hear, listen carefully, see if you can hear the liberalism oozing out of every word. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separate. We hold these truths to be self-evident. There's Thomas Reed, Francis Hutcheson, self-evident, common sense realism. That all men are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted by God? No. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from God? No. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Can't you just, liberalism is just dripping off this piece of paper. What am I reading? Declaration of Independence, which was drafted by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, profoundly influenced by the writings of John Locke and Thomas Reed and Francis Hutcheson and Montesquieu, all of these European Enlightenment liberals, what they were writing about, the kind of ideas they had in mind had their full fruition in the founding of the American Republic. So we see the liberal worldview very influential. What does this mean? How are we on time? Let's see. We got just a few minutes. What does this mean if you're a liberal, if you're operating from the liberal worldview? What does this mean about freedom of religion? If the purpose of the government is not to make me obedient to authority, but to protect my liberty and property and protect your liberty and property, and the government got here by us ceding some of our liberties in exchange for that protection, there are some liberties that we did not cede. There are some liberties that I didn't give up in order to get that protection. One of those is the freedom of conscience. Because what does it hurt if I'm worshiping one God and you're worshiping another? How am I destroying your property or your livelihood or your liberty? You see that liberal worldview? What does it matter what I'm worshiping? as long as I'm not touching your property. Let me read you this quote from Thomas Jefferson. The legitimate powers of government extend to acts regulating religion only as are injurious to others. But it does mean no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Why should I care what God you're worshiping? It doesn't bother me. That's the liberal perspective. Now, you had a lot of liberals, including Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. They were skeptical of religion generally. They had not just to establish religion, but to religion generally. Listen to this quote from Jefferson. Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burned, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. What has been the effect of this coercion? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. So they equated religion with ignorance, with oppression, with backwardsness, and illiberality. To this new liberal worldview, those old traditions and authorities were no longer relevant. And so they embraced a theology known as deism. Many of these liberals did. Not all of them, but many of them did. Anybody know what deism is? Yes, sir.
You believe in a higher power, but not necessarily the church or organized religion.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
One that interferes every day in your life.
Not one who exactly, yeah. So whereas, contrast this with the God of Calvinism. So the God of Calvinism is sovereign over every aspect. There's not a maverick molecule in the universe to the God of Calvinism, right? But deism conceived of God as the creator, but think of him like a clockmaker, someone who made a clock and wound it up, set it on the mantle, and then walked away, and let the natural laws, the natural processes, the natural forces run their course. That is the God of deism. And so you see the liberal worldview is what you have a very strong emphasis on personal liberty, on personal rights, on freedom of conscience, on equality of all people, and on secularism. There's this aversion to organized religion, and even among few of the liberals in the time of the founding, including Jefferson and Tom Paine and Benjamin Franklin, you have a deism. You have a rejection of traditional Christianity altogether. Okay, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get into republicanism, which is the most interesting of these three, but we will get into that next time. Any questions or comments? I'm not going to go anywhere until you guys are all gone. And so I'm here to answer questions, talk about this as long as you want to. Any comments?
Very interesting.
I'm sorry?
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Do you have any definition for establishment?
That's what this whole class is about. But hopefully 8 weeks from now you'll be able to answer that question, because I'm sure not, and I don't think the Supreme Court of the United States is.
They see a big case on
They've been trying to do this for 230 years. They still haven't done it.
So when you
They've done it a few times. They just keep changing their
They
mind.
keep exactly.
So when you're reading all these quotes from people that were significant philosophically and theologically in this era, that's all toward understanding the intent of the.
Yeah. So next time we'll talk about republicanism, and we'll look at. I want us to look at all three, because how I want you to understand these three is.
But so obviously you think you can understand the intent.
Well, that's the question I'm posing. Think of it like this. Somebody tell me what I'm drawing here.
can't see it.
Ben,
Venn diagram. So let's say you have republicanism, liberalism, Calvinism. You have individuals during the Revolutionary and Colonial and early Republican period that are going to fit into, there and here, they're going to be one or two of them together. Because the American worldview at the time of the framing, the time of the founding, is a synthesis, I would submit a synthesis of all three of these. If not a synthesis, a compromise. A compromise. Think of the First Amendment possibly as a compromise. You have these three people, because I mean, for instance, how do you reconcile Calvinism and liberalism? How do you reconcile John Winthrop with Thomas Jefferson? It's like mixing oil and water. But if they can arrive at an agreement, a compromise, that's possibly where we would have got the First Amendment. Now, that's up to you guys. What do you guys think? We'll talk about republicanism next time. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Condensed history. That's very fast.
A lot to cover.
Makes me want to.
When you're going from the Middle Ages to 1776 in an hour and a half, it's
Are you going to give us a reading list?
no.
How did you get to this point? with
All
this-
that stuff that you had in
with this?
college.
You've obviously been studying history for quite some time yourself.
I did. That was my undergrad major. Is history.
Yeah. Are you from here?
I'm sorry.
Are you from here?
I'm from Grayson County.
Was it Jefferson that said there should be law between religion?
Well, that's what. So Jefferson said that. And that's what that was the next quote I had actually to read before I got off. Is that letter to the Danbury Baptists, where that came from. But he got that from Roger Williams, the Baptist preacher.
Yeah.
That's a Baptist idea. That idea of a wall of separation is you had Roger Williams, John Leland, and Isaac Bacchus, the radical separatist Baptists. That originated from them.
Another, I don't know much, but I heard another thing. I read another thing the other day.
Yeah, part two,
It
absolutely.
said that the Baptists should consider Methodists Christian.
This
This
set
was
this up.
like an 18th.
You want to do it?
They were part of it. So it's just, wow, it's kind of hard to agree on.
So you like a conundrum?
I deal with conundrums every day. That's my
Yeah.
job.
Okay, so Thomas Jefferson wanted his writings, whatever, burned. But the Library of Congress burned it, and they took Jefferson's library and made it
Attorneys would have too
substituted
many of
for all
them.
the books that were lost.
Now, when I say that Thomas Jefferson wanted his I mean, there's language to suggest that they wanted their papers kept safe.
Too late for
Because
me.
people back then wrote.
If I hadn't had babies,
They wrote down all their thoughts. If you look at, for instance,
My number one, my daddy was an attorney, and I
it's called
My
James
daughter's an
Madison's
attorney,
Tax
so
Memorandum.
it's passed.
And that's when James Madison passed away, they went through his things and they found all these papers where he was writing down his thoughts.
Yeah.
But what he's writing down in his thoughts are so different than what he's actually saying in public. So it's like, is this really, but we're using these now. The courts are actually using these to try to get at what the First Amendment meant. But they didn't intend for these to be that, like that. So that's what's interesting, yeah.
It's sort of showing maybe the debate that's going on in his mind.
Mm-hmm. It
But
sure is.
maybe the conclusion was what he published.
I know. I wonder how they
Yeah, sure. Because if you read the detached memorandum, you can go and search it. James Madison's detached
Yeah,
memorandum.
exactly.
He, of course, James Madison was a Calvinist through and through. He was, James Madison, my quote next time, James Madison's right here. He is the culmination of all three.
David
Right?
Thomas.
And he was trained at Princeton under John Witherspoon, staunch, old school Scottish Presbyterian Calvinist, but he was best friends with Thomas Jefferson, and he was steeped in the classics and classical republicanism. And so you see all of this come to a head in James Madison, who is the individual who drafted the First Amendment. So that's kind of the point we're on to. We have all these influences culminating in one person who is the father of the Constitution.
Very good, sir.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing you guys next time.